that good? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Afternoon, everybody. I'm sure there are probably a few more people to filter in. For those of you who don't know me, a lot of you do, but some of you might not. I'm Robin LeBlanc. I'm on the politics faculty, and I have the distinct pleasure this afternoon of introducing our guest, Ambassador John Campbell. And I'm going to say just a few brief things in introduction. He's been here one other time to Washington and Lee. We found out a family friend of another faculty member, Associate Dean Oliver, and that's just been wonderful for us because he's been able to bring his expertise after a long career at the State Department and now at the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Campbell is the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. From 1975 to 2007, he was an officer in the U.S. Department of State Foreign Service. He served also, among many other posts, as U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria from 2004 to 2007, was posted in Lyon, in Paris, Geneva, and Pretoria, South Africa. He is, since he moved from the State Department to the Council on Foreign Relations, has been a prolific writer. He's the co-author of Nigeria, What Everyone Needs to Know, which was in its second edition in 2018, I believe that's right. But is also the single author of two other books, Morning in South Africa and Nigeria, Dancing on the Brink. And he has another book coming out also on Nigeria called Cutting the Cake. It's about the way in which divvying up oil revenues, something that is often quite corrupt, may also be part of the way of managing politics in Nigeria, and that should be out within the next year. Ambassador Campbell is not a stranger to this part of the world. He did his undergraduate degree at UVA. He taught briefly before his State Department career at Mary Baldwin, and then entered the Foreign Service. He also did a PhD at the University of Wisconsin. We're absolutely thrilled to have you, and I'm going to hand the podium over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. There are few people more intoxicated by the sound of their own voice than me. Nevertheless, I am going to try to exercise discipline and speak for, say, 25 minutes, leaving time for your questions and comments about Nigeria, about South Africa, or if any of you want to, what it's like being in the U.S. Foreign Service. Something I hope at least some of you will consider in terms of your own futures. I enjoy talking about Nigeria and South Africa. I had the privilege of living in both countries during momentous times. I was political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Lagos, Nigeria, from 1988 to 1990. That was a period when the military government was, yet again, promising to steer the country back to democracy. That didn't happen until long after I left. 14 years later, I returned as ambassador in 2004 and served until 2007 under the first Democratic administration since 1983. I was also political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria and Cape Town from 1993 to 1996 during South Africa's transition to non-racial democracy, during which time the embassy was working to help South Africa dismantle apartheid and establish non-racial democracy, in quotes. During the last years of apartheid, voting was by race. There was a white list, there was a colored list, there was an Asian list. There was no list for blacks, who were in fact 80% of the population. So what non-racial democracy refers to is voting free of racial designation. And South Africa's first non-racial election took place in 1994. I like writing books on Nigeria and South Africa. The book I'm working on now really tries to plumb the depths of Nigerian dysfunction. And let me tell you, you go pretty deep. It looks particularly at the pre-colonial and colonial roots of current Nigerian dysfunction. Each country in 2019 presents a different take on democracy in Africa. Both Nigeria and South Africa have the forms of democracy, including regular elections. However, the substance of democracy, the accountability of governance to the people in the context of the rule of law and human rights, is much more developed in South Africa than it is in Nigeria. I would go so far as to say South Africa is a genuine democracy, while in Nigeria, democracy remains an aspiration, a very, very powerful aspiration, but an aspiration that has not yet been realized. Both countries are large, though Nigeria is by far the largest. With 200 million people, every sixth African is a Nigerian. The population is projected to grow to 450 million by mid-century. Think about that. If you're 20 years old now, by the time you're 50, Nigeria will have 450 million people and will have, at that point, displaced the United States as the third largest country in the world by population. South Africa, by contrast, has a population of about 57 million, making it only the fifth largest country in Africa, and its population growth is modest. It's only about 1% a year. South Africa's population growth is roughly comparable to that of the United States. South Africa's economy is the most developed in sub-Saharan Africa, with internationally competitive mining, telecommunications, and financial companies. South Africa really does have a knowledge economy. Nigeria's economy, while on paper much larger, is heavily concentrated in oil and gas, though it too boasts other industries. If the price of oil and gas is high, Nigeria is Africa's largest economy. If the price of oil and gas is low, South Africa has Africa's largest economy. In terms of non-oil, perhaps the best known industry in Nigeria, certainly in many respects the most fascinating, is Nollywood. Nollywood is now the second largest producer of movies, behind Bollywood and Hollywood. Still, oil has historically provided well over half of the Nigerian government's revenue, and it provides more than 90% of Nigeria's foreign exchange. So fluctuations in the international price of oil can have massive consequences. Nollywood is intriguing because production costs are extremely low. It costs about $50,000 for Nollywood to produce a film. And Nollywood will typically produce a film in a 2-week time frame. The storyline is everything, not production values. And it's a bit like watching 1940s soap operas during the glory days of daytime TV in the United States. The audiences are huge. They are all over Africa, where Nollywood films are quite often shown in small villages on a piece of sheet that is hung between 2 trees, and somebody has a projector that is attached to a generator. Huge number of consumers of Nollywood. Both South Africa and Nigeria are culturally diverse. Nigeria has some 350 different ethnic and linguistic groups. And for that reason, Nigeria has opted for only one legal language, which is English. The difficulty with that is that English is spoken fluently by only about 10% of the population, though probably half of all Nigerians have some understanding of it. South Africa, by contrast, has 11 official languages, with more than a quarter of the population speaking Zulu as their first language. Only 9% of the population speaks English as a first language, even though that is the language of business, academia, media, and the arts. It's interesting. The percentage of the population that speaks English well in both Nigeria and South Africa is about 10%. All kinds of interesting implications to that. If both countries are diverse, the basis of their diversity is very different. Overlaying Nigeria's 350 ethnic groups are 2 religions roughly equal in size, Christianity and Islam. Islam in Nigeria dates back to the 11th century. It was introduced into the country by traders from across the Sahara. Christianity was introduced into Nigeria under British colonialism, mostly during the 19th century, though its growth exploded after independence in 1960. But Christianity is newer in Nigeria than Islam. An interesting point, Christian missionaries to Nigeria were not necessarily Europeans. The Anglican Church, for example, was introduced by African missionaries from Sierra Leone, led by Bishop Crowther, who was black. While religion is important, ethnic differences tend to dominate in both countries. Where ethnic and religious boundaries coincide, there is often strife. For example, in the middle of Nigeria, there is fierce fighting between Fulani, Muslim, cattle herders, and Christian, Barome farmers. If a person is killed, and some 3,000 were last year, if a person is killed, is he being killed because of his ethnicity, or because of his religion, or because of the way he wants to use the land? The answers to those questions are complex. Unfortunately, the Western media tends to reduce farmer-herder conflict in the Middle Belt to somehow or another a conflict between Christianity and Islam. Much more complex than that. South Africa, too, has many different ethnic groups. But unlike Nigeria, most South Africans are Christians. Rather than by religion, South Africans are divided by race. Whites are about 9% of the population. Another 9% comprises coloreds, spelled like the English do, C-O-L-O-U-R-E-D-S. The term is not pejorative in South Africa, and coloreds regard themselves as a separate race, not of mixed race. Blacks are about 80% of the population, and the remainder is of Asian descent, mostly from South Asia. Though both countries are diverse, South Africans of all ethnic and racial groups have a strong identity as South Africans. Western, not tribal, dress is common. By contrast, the Nigerian sense of national identity is weak, and it's getting weaker. Loyalty amongst Nigerians is primarily to family, religion, and ethnic group, rather than, and often in spite of, the state. For what it is worth, this is supported by survey data, which shows that identification with the state is the lowest among 16 African countries that were surveyed. Interestingly, Tanzania was the highest. This lack of a strong sense of national identity for we outsiders is not intuitive. I would suggest that is because Nigerians working in international business or politics tend to identify more strongly as Nigerian than most of the population. Yet, these are the Nigerians you and I will most likely meet. But they are a tiny minority amongst the 200 million Nigerians. A sign of declining national identity. When I first went to Nigeria in 1988, Nigerians wore each other's tribal dress simply because they liked the style or they liked the color, rather like the way Scots wear each other's tartans. Alas, that is no longer the case. Both countries are characterized by gross inequality of income. South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient of any country in the world. The Gini coefficient is a statistical measure of inequality of income. In both countries, there is a small minority of rich people and a very large majority of poor people. But a generation after the end of apartheid in South Africa, economic and social inequality is still largely along racial lines. Two examples. The gulf between white wealth, not wages, not salaries, white wealth, and that of everybody else is greater now than it was in 1994. Unemployment in the black townships approaches 50%. But in South Africa, democratic institutions and culture provide a framework for addressing such issues. And inequality is a lively political issue openly debated in the public forum in South Africa. Wealth in Nigeria is sourced from oil, all of which is owned by the state. Getting rich in Nigeria involves, even requires, varying levels of what we would regard as corrupt behavior. But it wasn't until the oil shocks of the 1970s dramatically increased the price of oil that Nigerians came to rely on it so heavily. From then on, oil sucked up all of the attention, most of the attention of government bureaucrats, foreign investors, and businesses. While it is difficult to foresee what the future will be, it's important to remember that truly democratic institutions in Nigeria are underdeveloped, and they are unable to serve as a check on elite corrupt behavior and the fundamental issues related to poverty, education, or health. Now, South Africa is also beset by corruption, but it takes place in a much less permissive environment. Unlike in Nigeria, it is not structural. By structural, I mean in Nigeria, corruption so infuses economic transactions that it is difficult to do business without it. In South Africa, corruption is simply criminal behavior. Corruption in South Africa is episodic. In Nigeria, corruption is the way the economy and the society operate. It's the rules under which they operate. An example of South African corruption: former President Jacob Zuma called a swimming pool that he installed at his private house at public expense. He justified it as a fire safety feature. That fooled nobody, and in fact is an element in the various court cases moving against Zuma. Different example in Nigeria. Loyalties, family, ethnic group, religion. How does that translate? I'm in a position to give my brother-in-law a job at the foreign ministry. If I fail to do so, I am violating social norms. In the United States, when I was in personnel at the State Department, if I got my brother-in-law a job and I was caught, and I probably would be caught, I would go to jail. The networks of loyalties are different. There is little that is new about South Africa's root challenges. They include the consequences of apartheid, post-apartheid exposure to new competition from the international economy, and pandemic disease, especially HIV/AIDS. At various times, up to a third of the population has been HIV positive. Though we have to be careful about comparisons. South African statistics are quite good. The statistics from other countries in Africa are quite bad. So it's hard to know how much difference there is between the prevalence of HIV/AIDS in South Africa and in other African countries. It's also easy to forget that corruption was also a characteristic of the apartheid state. Those of you that go to South Africa in the coming year may find that, particularly in terms of public discourse, there is a lot of gloom. I would suggest that the gloom owes much to the slow economic recovery South Africa has experienced from the worldwide slump of 2008 and its impact on commodity prices, which affects South Africa, which of course is a major exporter of gold and coal. Nevertheless, I maintain that post-apartheid South Africa is stalled, not broken. The current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was a close confidant of Nelson Mandela and not personally corrupt, even though he's very rich. The highly respected Ibrahim Index of African Governance for 2017, the most recent figures I had access to, places South Africa at the top of its 5 analytical categories: safety, rule of law, human rights, economic opportunity, and human development. The only states that it placed higher were small and relatively wealthy: Mauritius, Botswana, and Cape Verde. By the way, if you're seeking a comparison of the quality of governance among African states, the Ibrahim Index is probably the best place to go. South Africa is a constitutional democracy, not a parliamentary democracy. The power of government, including parliament, is limited by the Constitution, which is generally regarded as among the best in the world from the perspective of the protection of human rights. Let me cite 2 examples. The Constitution, and particularly the human rights provisions of it, provided the judicial basis for rulings that, in effect, prohibit capital punishment. Capital punishment is a violation of human rights under the South African Constitution. Alone among African countries, the Constitution is also the basis for gay marriage. South Africa is the only country in Africa that permits gay marriage. Polls indicate that both rulings are unpopular, especially among the black majority, especially among the constituency of the governing African National Congress, or the ANC. But such is the prestige of the Constitution that no government has sought to amend the Constitution to permit capital punishment and to prohibit gay marriage. The Constitution protects absolute freedom of speech, as the booing of then-President Jacob Zuma at Nelson Mandela's funeral demonstrated. A sign of strength of the rule of law, of which the Constitution is the head, is the contentious question of land distribution from whites to blacks. At least 80% of the population across all racial lines believes that it should be done strictly according to the law. Blacks, much more than other racial groups, believe that whites are due no compensation for their property that the state redistributes. But they too affirm that any such distribution must be governed by the law. In other words, no Zimbabwe's here, please. No simple occupation of farms by groups of people. any land redistribution must be a part of a legal process, and the Constitution, among other things, also guarantees the right of private property. As for Nigeria, it's commonly said that it fails to live up to its potential. It has Africa's largest economy most of the time. It remains a petrostate in terms of the source of government revenue. Nigerians commonly regard the government as weak, corrupt, and failing to address the country's problems. Corruption remains deeply embedded in all aspects of national life, with some Africans will argue, notably Stephen Ellis, that criminality now infects greater society as well as weakening the formal state structure. Absent a positive state presence in most of daily life, people turn to kin and ethnic groups for security, justice, and to secure their livelihoods. A social contract between the government and the governed is still rudimentary. Few pay taxes. Nigerian leaders, the elites, source the bulk of their wealth and influence directly or indirectly to access to government-owned oil. And, as I've already mentioned, an estimated 80% of oil earnings end up in the hands of an estimated 1% of the population. And that 1% is so rich that it distorts the luxury real estate market in New York and London. How to account for the different trajectories of Africa's most important states, both of which have democratic forms? Part of the answer, maybe even most of the answer, is history. South Africa has been a limited democracy since 1911. That year, only white males had the right to vote. White women got the suffrage in 1939, and then all races and genders got the suffrage in 1994. But what happened in 1994 was that democracy was extended to hitherto excluded parts of the population. It did not have to be invented. Democracy and the rule of law had become indigenous to South Africa, even if it was whites only. And under apartheid, there were numerous cases of the South African judiciary throwing out cases bought by the white government, notably a case, a treason charge against Nelson Mandela. But in Nigeria, democracy and the rule of law in modern forms has largely been created over the past century, and they are associated with the West, particularly in the North, particularly among radicalized Muslims. South Africa's culture of the rule of law, in its modern form, dates from the British acquisition of the Western Cape in 1806. However, it built on a tradition of Dutch law in place since the 17th century. Limited democracy based on the rule of law helped support the development of a large modern economic sector during the course of the 19th century. The rule of law has been reinforced by pride in the country's new constitution and the high quality of Nelson Mandela's leadership. It's often forgotten that Mandela was a lawyer and that he was the first black admitted to the South African bar. Lawyers tend to believe in the rule of law. The Nigerian experience was different. Earlier in the 20th century, the British cobbled together disparate but adjacent West African territories they had acquired during the 19th century. The process was completed in 1914. In 1960, the British abruptly brought Nigeria to independence. A sense of Nigerian national identity was so weak that the northern part of the country resisted independence, preferring distant London to near-at-hand Lagos. The rule of law had little time to develop, and the executive regularly compromised the independence of the judiciary after independence. In fact, Nigerian independence was followed by a series of military coups and a civil war that left more than 2 million dead. At the time the Civil War ended, oil production reached unimaginable levels, creating instant wealth, but also largely destroying the country's export and industrial base. At independence, Nigeria's level of economic development was seen to be on par with Taiwan or Malaysia. Now its social and economic statistics are among the worst in the world. A series of military chiefs of state, some better than others, never reached the level of, say, a Nelson Mandela or a Thabo Mbeki. Corrupt elections eviscerated popular confidence in democratic institutions. The burden of history has been heavy in South Africa and in Nigeria, but it's been heavier in Nigeria. Stephen Ellis has observed that failing states are not like an automobile that has broken down and can be fixed with a new part. Rather, they're like sick people. Recovery is by fits and starts, and it takes a long time. I think that analogy applies well to Nigeria. I hope I've said enough to introduce you to Africa's two largest economies and with the continent's most influential politics, and I would be happy to take any questions or comments that you might have. Yes, sir.
Sir, you didn't mention Boko Haram at all during your talk. Who are these people and why can they seem to act with impunity?
They are an Islamic jihadist movement with some popular roots, drawing on a long-term tradition of protest in northern Nigeria that takes religious forms. You get in northern Nigeria, every 10 to 15 years, a kind of eruption, always using an Islamic vocabulary. The last one before Boko Haram was the Maitatsini. The goal is virtually always to create the kingdom of God on earth through justice for the poor by the strict implementation of Islamic law. Think about those words. There's nothing in those words that implies a political or economic program. Boko Haram, like Maitatsini, does not advance a 10-point program to strengthen the northern Nigerian economy. It's not that kind of thing. Because it seeks the transformation of people, and because it has very rigid sense of boundaries, anyone outside those boundaries, if male, is liable to be killed, if female, to be sold into slavery. In both cases, this is based on 7th century texts, which it literally interprets. Let me take your question one step further. Boko Haram is in the far northeastern part of the country, far away from Lagos, Ibadan, the oil districts. Because of the weakness of national identity in Nigeria, my experience has been that people who live in the parts of Nigeria in which there has been some economic development, they dismiss it as far away and having nothing to do with them. I met with the editorial board of a Lagos newspaper last year when I was in Lagos, and their reaction to Boko Haram was, they're vermin, kill them all. I asked, how do you know the people that have been rounded up by the military are Boko Haram? How do you know that? And the response was very close to that of the French monarchy to the Albigensian heresy in the 14th century. It was, kill them all, God will know his own. There was, yes, sir.
South Africa recently had a xenophobic riots. Do you think that there's a reflection of something changing in the country, or is it such a small minority that pass?
The xenophobia is worrisome, and it's not new. There have been a number of waves of xenophobia at various times. The number, by the way, of foreigners in South Africa is grossly exaggerated in South African discourse. South African population statistics are quite good, and the percentage of the South African population that is foreign-born, comes from outside of South Africa, the percentage is lower than it is in the United States. But the point is, in the townships, the percentage of people living on the margins is very large. And so the reaction to what is perceived to be competition, particularly from small shopkeepers, can be very fierce. There's a related dimension to this, and that is, even historically, police presence in townships has been small. What Ramaphosa, on his kind of charm offensive around Africa after the latest outbreak of xenophobia, what he has promised to do is to step up security service presence in the townships. We'll see if it works. Yes, sir.
Could you touch a little bit, maybe seeing how Chinese foreign direct investment into sub-Saharan Africa, is that relevant to Nigeria? What impact is it having on?
It hasn't been terribly relevant up to now, but I think soon will be. The Chinese are in the process of rebuilding the Nigerian railway network. And President Buhari has expressed interest in essentially swaps of Nigerian oil for Chinese infrastructure. So I think we will probably start to see a good deal more of the Chinese presence. Let me tell you, the Chinese can operate very skillfully. Their embassy in Abuja was across the street from mine. Mine looked like a fortress with a line of visa applicants sort of curling around in the hot sun. Theirs was this lovely light glass building. And when you went inside into the foyer, what there was a pool. And crossing the pool was one of these pretty little red Chinese bridges. The Chinese ambassador to Nigeria had a Chinese chef, and he also had a French chef. Chinese use of soft power, the Confucius centers, for example, in Nigeria has been very impressive. I'm a lot more worried about Chinese use of soft power than I am about Chinese investment. Yes, sir.
Can you describe some of your experience you've had while serving the Foreign Service, particularly in Nigeria or South Africa?
Experiences that I have had.
Or like kind of the role you played as ambassador?
As ambassador? As ambassador, you are chief of mission. That means you're the president's personal representative to the chief of state. And so I would have some interaction with the then president, Olusegun Obasanjo. In addition, the ambassador is the chief of mission. That means he is responsible for all of the activities of federal agencies, US federal agencies, in Nigeria, such as the Centers for Disease Control, for example, or the work done by the Department of Agriculture and by USAID to help support Nigerian agriculture. He is also responsible for the overall direction of public diplomacy in the country. My two particular themes were elections and what we could do to improve them, and also what to do about the yawning gap between what Nigerian law says about gender equality and about how people behave. Does that sort of get at what you were, yeah? Yes, sir.
Related to Nigeria specifically, what do you think some of the goals are for the Chinese government in using that soft power to exert its influence?
It's a very good question, and I think it's actually a pretty subtle question. If you were at the Department of Defense in Washington and you pose that question, the answer you would get is they are looking for a guaranteed supply of oil. And Nigeria's oil reserves are immense. The reality is considerably more subtle than that. What the Chinese are looking for is international influence in all of the various meanings of that word. For example, the Chinese have played an important and positive role in the South Sudan. The Chinese are now providing peacekeepers for UN missions. Just as the United States has receded from Africa in almost every way, the Chinese have increased their presence, but in a way that goes beyond the sort of ugly Chinaman stereotype. Remember the stereotype of a few years ago? The Chinese come into Africa, but they won't hire local labor. Now they do. In other words, they learn. I think the bottom line for the Chinese is the acknowledgement by the rest of the world that they are a great power in all of the various meanings of that word. Yes, ma'am.
So this is a question regarding South Africa's inequality. So I think in 2015, the Gini coefficient was something like 0.63, which is crazy.
Yeah.
So you were saying that democratic institutions are working against it. So what are some of the, what are things that are being done to work against this inequality?
A nonstop conversation in civil society, in politics, within the government, as to how to address the real problem, which is not the wealth of some people, but rather the poverty of too many people. In other words, how do you develop the economy in a way that benefits the vast majority of the poor? There's a very interesting aspect to South Africa. It dates from the days of apartheid. The trade union movement in South Africa traditionally worked for a very high wage, high skilled economy. And they have that. The difficulty is that doesn't provide work for people who are desperately poor, particularly the very large percentage of them who speak no English. The lack of English in townships precludes the establishment of things like call centers, such as we have seen in India. Okay, fine. So one of the things you do in a situation like this is you reform the educational system, particularly primary education. Not so easy. 11 legal languages in South Africa. All languages are legally equal. And yet, 25% of the population speaks Zulu, but Zulu is not a language of international commerce. Do you teach a 6-year-old in his native language, the language he's using with his mother and father, which is Zulu, or do you teach him in English? And if you choose the latter, are you not pulling that child out of his family circle, to a certain extent at least?
But then, for example, in Ethiopia, most of the schools, they do it exactly this way. They teach it in English and not in Amharic.
They do.
And like many people prefer to send their kids to English schools.
Particularly middle class and above. Same is true in South Africa. Exactly the same is true. But there is a difference. And the difference is South Africa is a democratic country. Ethiopia is not. Therefore, the Ethiopian government can make decisions and do things that no democratic government can do by fiat. In other words, they can do it, but they have to develop a consensus in favor of doing it, or at least a majority of support for it. There are lots of other things at play here. The African National Congress, the ruling party, a principal electoral support for it comes from the South African teachers' unions. And like all teachers' unions, they tend to be resistant to change. The point is, there is a relationship between poverty, access to the modern economy, and education, all of which are very complicated, and you can't just wave a magic wand and have them go away. Does that help?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
Since you said that Nigeria is in the process of democratic consolidation, so can you talk a little bit more about the overall image of its civil and political society, and is there any stateless issue involved in there?
Stateless issues?
Stateless, are there separate groups within the political society?
Yes, yes, there are. Well, the most obvious is in the Niger Delta, where the oil is produced. There is a revival of interest in Biafran separatism, which led to the Civil War. But it's more than that. Boko Haram and associated Islamist movements in the north look to destroy the secular state, destroy the Nigerian state. The difference between Boko Haram is it uses violence, but there are lots of other groups in the north that are not violent, but still seek to see the Nigerian state dissolve. When we talk about consolidation of democracy in Nigeria, the big issue here is the relation between the government and the governed. And there, a significant percentage, I would even hazard a majority, of the Nigerian population has as little to do with the government as it possibly can, and sees government as essentially something that is harmful to them. Unless or until that can be overcome by government provision of essential services, it's going to be hard to carry democracy to its next level. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
This is a bit of a follow-up question to what I was asking earlier, but being on the Council of Foreign Relations, I'm sure you probably have an opinion on this, but do you think that there is a sufficient sense of urgency in the State Department and the United States federal government as a whole in response to Chinese interests in Africa as a whole?
I think it's misplaced. There is certainly a focus on it. John Bolton, who was National Security Advisor until he was fired a couple of weeks ago, and I worked for him at one point, has highly alarmist views about China. What concerns me is that too much of the discussion recalls Cold War rhetoric. And it's not the same. I mean, it's different. It's really altogether different. So if you fixate on China in the terms of the old Soviet Union, you're asking the wrong questions, and the policy that you develop is probably not going to be very effective. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit about women's situation in both Nigeria and South Africa? Would they have different status because the level of democratization is different?
It's an extremely interesting question. South Africa, absolute gender equality enshrined in the Constitution. But in the so-called tribal trust areas, particularly the Kingdom of KwaZulu-Natal, where there is a king, King Goodwill Zwelithini, who essentially administers the tribal trust territory according to Zulu custom and tradition. Women they don't have equality, they have hardly any standing in anything, in direct violation of the South African Constitution. Direct. How do you manage this? Another example, we often talk about the land issue in South Africa. Tribal trust lands are administered by the chief. No fee simple ownership, no security of tenure. You can be booted off if the chief doesn't like the look on your face. How do you manage these residual traditional governing structures in a modern state? Not so simple. Nigeria. At base, 350 different ethnic groups, so the status of women varies tremendously from one place to another. What is striking is that you will often see women in public positions like the foreign minister, the finance minister, the president of the Lagos Stock Exchange. But absolutely parallel to that is extreme patriarchy within the family. Two different systems. We outsiders see this one, but not this one. And further, it varies tremendously from place to place. The chief of state, when I was there as ambassador, Olusegun Obasanjo, knew perfectly well what the American view was on gender equality, and he played to it shamelessly in terms of making public appointments of women that meant nothing, but there was a title, and he could point to it. So that's why your question is really very fundamental, and there's no simple answer to it that I can give.
We have time for maybe one more question. Well, if not, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.